All right, Blake. So I wanted to give a delicious, delicious Tesla podcast for all the people who don't like Fungineering, but just stay subscribed to us in case we publish something about Tesla. Which, I don't know, I guess is probably like 95% of the people who are subscribed. So I don't want to go into like all the numbers like really deep. I will use a lot of numbers. I'll only guarantee them to be plus or minus 10% of the real number because I'm doing all of this off the top of my head. The only notes I've prepared are 6 bullet points that are sentence fragments. So the theme though that I want to get into is how you read these things in the news about a company and specifically about Tesla and you think, oh man, that sounds really bad. Like they're doomed. They'll be closing their doors any day now. And then you read something the next day and it's like, oh man, they're going to be $1 trillion company. And everything is kind of magnified out of proportion from reality.
Yeah.
And the basic problem is we have very imperfect information. We only get what's leaked from employees, what Elon tweets about, what's in SEC filings from Tesla, things like that. So we have a very bad understanding of what's really going on. And so in the absence of hard facts, we have a lot of speculation. And so I want to tell some interesting things about what's been happening at Tesla recently and use those to illustrate this and how you can get into trouble when you're trying to invest and you're trying to, in this case, make a bet on a company going bankrupt. So the first example I have is the Model 3 production numbers. So we rely on Tesla to give us these. They release them the day after the end of each quarter. They'll release a little memo on their website and it'll have it broken down by Model S, Model X, and Model 3. It'll have production numbers and delivery numbers and in-transit numbers because you have some vehicles you've produced and they're on their way to a customer, so they're not delivered yet. And the big goal for the Model 3 for the last 2 years nearly, or 2.5 almost now, since they announced it, was 5,000 cars per week, and then eventually out in the future, 10,000 Model 3s per week production. So at the end of the fourth quarter of 2017, they released this memo, and they released it like January 1st of 2017 or something. They released a memo and they said, hey, we produced over 800 cars, I believe they said, in the final week of the quarter. And in the last 3 days or so, we produced cars at a rate that would extrapolate to 1,000 Model 3s per week.
Yeah. And
so they gave this expectation that they were producing 1,000 a week. And so a lot of people took that and they said, hey, that's, it's not as good as where they originally said they wanted to be, which was 5,000 a week at that point in time, the end of 2017. But it's 1,000, okay. And people took that as gospel, and they kind of ran with it all through the first quarter of 2018. Well, we get to the end of the first quarter of 2018, and on, I guess, April 1st, they released the numbers for first quarter production. And they tell you how many Model 3s they produced during the first quarter of 2018. And if you divide it by about 13 weeks and a quarter, what you got was that their average production rate was about 780 cars a week. And so you look at this and you say, wait, you guys implied that you were producing at 1,000 cars a week exiting the previous quarter and coming into the first quarter. And then at the end of the first quarter, it turns out you were only producing 780 a week through the whole quarter. And if you imagine a graph of, over time of the whole quarter, you would imagine a low number on the left side and a little gentle curve or a straight line, or, imagine some shape that generally goes up towards the end of the quarter that's weekly production.
Yeah, that would make the most sense.
And so, right. I mean, they're increasing the capacity of the plant. So you would think, well, you should have some big weeks on the right side of the graph at the end of the quarter, and the left side must be really low. And then you start thinking, well, maybe the sustained rate at the end of the fourth quarter was actually only, I don't know, three, four, 500 cars a week. It was something much lower. And so you're confronted with this problem where you had thought it was 1,000, and then it turns out later that it was only 780 on average. And so you've got this disconnect because of a lack of information, because you've had kind of wishy-washy statements from Tesla where they say, we produced at a rate that extrapolates to 1,000 a week. Well, what that really meant was, they had a guy with a whip, and he was whipping a guy with a stun baton, and he was stunning the workers to make them work faster assembling cars for the final 3 days of the fourth quarter. And it was not a sustainable rate of production.
I like your hierarchy of whipping and stun batons.
Yeah, if you want to get serious, you got to have a hierarchy of it. You might have someone, you probably have somebody behind the guys with the whips, like someone threatening to kill his family.
To hit 1,000 cars.
So you have this imperfect information because you have this loosey-goosey kind of statement that Tesla has made, and then you don't really have anything else to base it on for another 3 months when they give an update, when they say, here's how many we actually produced. So the same thing happened at the end of the first quarter. At the end of the first quarter, they said, hey, we're producing at, I believe it was 2,500 Model 3s per week. And they even said, hey, it's a sustained rate. We can keep this up. It's not a burst rate. Because, people were kind of on to them by then. It turns out about a week before that, before the end of the first quarter, there had been an email leaked from inside the company from former executive vice president of engineering, Doug Field, that basically said, we're going to pull a bunch of people off the Model S and X combined assembly line, and we're going to move them over to the Model 3 assembly line to burst the production for the final week to get a big number. And this email got leaked, so people knew this kind of thing was coming. And so at the end of the quarter, the memo comes out and it says, here's how many we made, and our production rate at the end of the first quarter of 2018 is 2,500. It was 2,000 per week, and then what they said was within a couple weeks we'll be at 2,500, I recall now. So you think, okay, 2,000 per week. And then you have a lack of information for 3 more months. There were some other leaked memos that pertain to production. It turned out in retrospect, once we got good numbers at the end of the second quarter, that those leaked memos were hard to decipher. They didn't give really great data. It was in the ballpark, but it surely was not actionable, even though none of this information on its own is actionable. So at the end of the second quarter, the numbers for Model 3 production for Q2 come out. You divide it by 13, and what you get is that the average rate of production was about 2,200 per week. So more than the 2,000 that they claimed to enter the quarter with, but you would still say, well, if they entered at 2,000 and the average was 2,200, and then they claimed to leave the second quarter with this big burst of production to a 5,000 Model 3 per week run rate for 1 week, most of that chart in between there is pretty flat. And then you have this big peak on the right side where there's 5,000 cars per week suddenly at the end of the second quarter.
Yeah.
And so we've had this problem where we lack the information, so everything is filled in with speculation. And of course, if you're inclined to like Tesla and believe what Tesla says, then during the whole second quarter, you were probably saying, oh yeah, they started at 2,000. They were at 2,500 within a couple weeks, just like Elon said they'd be. And then there was a tweet at some point during the quarter where he said that they had surpassed 3,500 per week. And then at the end of the quarter, they were at 5,000. And you were inclined to believe that during the quarter before you got the real production number. And if you were more skeptical about it, or you don't like Elon, or you don't like Tesla or whatever, then you probably said something like, they were lying about it last time, they're lying this time, and, they're probably at 1,500 per week, and they're struggling to build it up above that. And neither side really knew until you get to the end of the quarter. So now we come to the end of the second quarter, which was the end of June, and Tesla claims that in the last week of June, they produced 5,000 Model 3s. Okay. So immediately we see this problem where some people in the financial press pick that up, they believe it on its face, and they say, yeah, they produce 5,000, they're there. They're making 5,000 a week from now on. And you probably shouldn't believe that. You know, Elon is probably cracking the whip. I mean, who knows what he's doing to motivate the assassins, who motivate the whip crackers, who motivate the stun baton guys. But, you know, needless to say, that 5,000 Model 3 week was, I don't want to call it fake. It actually happened, but it was not sustainable at that point in time. And there were some additional weasel words that were used, like factory gated. They said that they produced 5,000 factory gated cars, which doesn't have a strong concrete definition in the automotive industry. People are left kind of grasping what that means.
Does it imply the cars were they were assembled, but then not all of them were fit to leave the factory? Like they needed rework?
Yes, and people aren't really sure if it means that they were almost done and then they installed the last, you know, the rear view mirror or the floor mats and they crossed the finish line and now we count them, or if it means that we got them to the point of almost being done, but they can't leave the factory yet. But they're 99.99% done. We don't really know because factory gated, I've still not seen a good resolution of what that term actually is supposed to mean. So it's a Weasley word, and then there were some leaks from the company that said, well, we skipped the brake test that you perform, the automated test you perform at the end of a car assembly line that tests the brakes and the drivetrain and the steering alignment and those things. It turns out they were skipping that test so they could just move the cars out of the way faster as they were coming off the line. And then they were probably going to come back later and perform that test. But again, we're in this dead zone right now. So we're in the third quarter. This is July 23rd of 2018 when we're recording this. We don't know what the actual production is right now. So it's difficult to make any good decisions based on that because there won't be any good information on it. There might be some next week at the conference call. Wednesday, August 1st is the Q2 financial quarterly conference call. There might be a question about that, but again, we could just get a Weasley answer that doesn't mean much. So it's all about a lack of information.
So what do you think is the point of trying to burst production numbers so much? They're clearly doing it, right? Because they're always, at the end of a quarter, they're like, we did this in the last week. So we know there's bursting going on, except it seems like the first time you do it, when everyone acts like it's up for debate, whether that's the true run rate going forward or whether that's like a temporary run rate. But once you've done it once and then it resolves, either it was the real run rate or it was a burst, then when you do it again, it's like if you give someone $10 for Christmas and the next year they expect at least $10. It's sort of like all you've done is set this expectation that you're going to burst it. And it doesn't, like if you'd say one of the reasons to do this is to manipulate the press, it doesn't seem like it manipulates the press as effectively the second and third time.
And yet it did.
Yeah, I guess so.
You know, a lot of writers in the financial press were printing it without question that, oh, Tesla is now at 5,000 cars a week. And even professional financial writers, not just like the financial arm of the traditional junk press in the US, you know, like those unknown anonymous writers who write that junk, like guys who are named and are professional career writers for outlets where they publish articles and get paid and there's a reputation for the writer. Even they have bought it and have said, yeah, they're at 5,000 a week now. Why wouldn't you believe it? The cynical answer I have to your question, Blake, is that it makes a great headline and we are still not over the hill yet for the press as a whole taking Tesla and Elon Musk headlines on their face. So, they will still take something that Elon says and more than half the time publish it without any critical thinking. And I think that's part of why it happens.
What's the benefit though? So say you burst your run rate to 5K cars, and then you're like, we did 5K cars, and then the press runs it. Still, what benefit do you get? Like, bursting has a cost to it. You stop producing S's and X's.
Yeah.
You make your employees unhappy. Mm-hmm. It's just a bunch of work to manage this. So what's the payoff that you get that's worth flipping your company upside down 1 week out of every quarter?
That's between you and Elon. I cannot answer that. I have no idea why you would do that. I mean, okay. if I were running the company, I would just, I'd do a lot of things differently, but
one or two.
One of the many things I would do differently is I would just report, like, here's the last 1 week period we had, and here's what we achieved. And then I might say something like, oh yeah, there was another fire at the factory and that kind of slowed us down. So, bear that in mind. There's so much effort that is put into controlling the narrative about Tesla. So much effort by Elon particularly, and Tesla's PR department more generally. And I think this just kind of stokes that. It helps to that end.
Is it valuable to pump the stock because you expect to be selling stock to pay off debt later?
It would be eventually, but you would want to orchestrate this much closer to that event.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like doing it every quarter makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, maybe the other thing is that maybe Elon orders this to happen and he says, okay, we're going to burst to 5,000. We're running 24 hours a day and you're just going to have to whip harder and electrocute more. And we'll get there. And maybe in his mind, he says, okay, after we hit that 5,000, maybe we'll only drop down to 4,500 a week. Maybe we'll drop down to 4,000. He probably has no real concrete expectation. But part of it may be just seeing how high can we keep the rate afterwards? What can we resolve while we're doing this in order to keep the rate up later?
But if you do something temporary, like pull people off the Model S and X line, you're just going to put them back later.
Mm-hmm.
So no one would be under any illusions that like speed improvement is going to persist.
I would take any better explanations.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense to me either.
Maybe our listeners can go explain it on the Reddit.
Yes.
If you think you have an explanation, please tell us. I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, I would too. What benefit, pulling workers, making them unhappy, running the line, potentially having complications with quality because you have guys who aren't normally working on the Model 3 and they're coming over to hammer in the screws on the Model 3 instead of the Model S. Things like that. I can't understand where the benefit is except publicity. So the second bullet point I wanted to talk about was the tent that they built an additional general assembly line in. So sometime in June, Elon starts tweeting about this tent, and really people picked it up earlier than that. People were examining satellite photos of the factory on a daily basis. There are drone flyovers every day. And so people keep up a persistent surveillance of the Fremont factory. And they saw this structure being built. They saw that it was a very long and narrow structure. And then eventually they figured out it was this semi-permanent sprung structure. So it's not really a tent. I think people kind of call it that in a derogatory way, but it's rated to stay up for a long time. It's rated for people to work in. It's rated to have air conditioning installed eventually. But Tesla started building this tent next to their factory, and it ended up being about 150 feet wide and about 900 feet long, I think were the final dimensions. And it turns out they put a second Model 3 General Assembly line in it. So the way this works is when you have a car factory, it's broadly broken up into three parts. You have the body in white, which is where they do all the stamping and welding of the main body pieces. Then you have the paint shop where they prime and paint the car. And then you have general assembly where you install everything else into this now painted shell. And so the factory has a general assembly line for the S, another for the X, and one for the Model 3. And so they built this fourth line, which was the second Model 3 general assembly. Now, this immediately begs the question, why did they do this? Well, because they weren't getting the throughput that they needed on their first Model 3 assembly line in order to reach 5,000 cars per week. That's the obvious answer. They weren't getting that throughput because they had reduced the number of robots working on the line, because they were trying to have the robots do very dexterous manual tasks that robots are not well designed for. And they ended up just needing a second entire line to do this. They didn't have time to build more room in the factory. The factory is packed to the gills. Elon has said as much on several occasions that the factory is just totally full. And so they built this tent. So here's where the lack of information theme comes in. This tent starts being built, and people don't know what it is for a while. And finally, Elon starts tweeting about it, and he says, oh, well, we built this tent for another general assembly line. And here's the first car rolling off the line. And comically, it's this picture of a red Model 3, and it's at the end of the line. It's just a still photograph, but you can see that only half of the bolts to anchor the line into the ground have been installed. So all of these like raised platforms that the car rolls along, only every other bolt has actually been installed. And there's a car sitting on it, and it appears to be complete. Was it built on that line? I don't know. No one knows. And so, again, the detractors immediately say, they just brought that car over with a forklift, set it down on the line, snapped the picture. And, of course, the fans say, hey, they built an entire general assembly line in 2.5 or 3 weeks, whatever it was Elon claimed. And look at that. Now they're going to be cranking these cars out. But, you need to think about this in another way. That line requires more people. So now your labor expenses per car are higher. It required a bunch of equipment. They needed to buy equipment to, if nothing else, simply the conveyance system that moves the car down the line.
I don't think your labor expenses per car are necessarily higher. Like, imagine you have a factory that can produce 1,000 cars per time unit, and then you build a second copy of it that uses the same number of people, and it can produce 1,000 cars per time unit. Your employee cost per car is going to be the same.
You're going to have additional expenses like moving parts out to the extra factory, moving car frames out to the factory because it's not hooked up to the paint shop of the main factory. So you're going to have some additional overhead expenses. You need additional maintenance for double the machines, double the assembly line.
I feel like that factors in, though. If you, say you just have factory A and it's producing 1,000 cars, and then you just have factory B and it produces 1,000 cars, and they're the same. Like, none of your costs per car would necessarily increase. I guess what you're saying is they've made general assembly a little less efficient because now there's like these two lines.
Yeah.
But it doesn't like double your cost. No. It does increase it a little.
It does increase it, though. And you had to pay the expense of building this sprung structure. You had to acquire new equipment. You have the expense of workers spending time to build the assembly line out there. A one-time cost of that.
That's true.
And so we came to the end of the second quarter, a couple weeks after the tent went up. And Tesla claims, hey, we made our 5,000 Model 3s in the last week of the quarter, and 1,000 of them came off of this tented assembly line. And you start to think, well, okay, going forward, what's the goal here? Is the goal, the original plan was never to have 2 general assembly areas for Model 3. Is the plan eventually to get the one that's inside the factory up to full efficiency and dismantle this one? Is it to leave this one running forever? It's unclear. And so we don't really know what's going on here, and we don't know how that's going to impact the company going forward. We don't know how that's going to impact things like, improving efficiency on the line. If you make some kind of improvement on General Assembly 3, you have to also do that on General Assembly 4 now. So it introduces more uncertainty.
What's your best guess for what the final plan is for this tented assembly line?
I think the ultimate plan would be to get the originally designed Model 3 General Assembly area working properly, where it is capable of running 5,000 cars per week, and then use the tinted structure for just more storage. Because one thing they've complained about is that they are up to their eyeballs in car parts at that factory. They don't have room for anything. And that's a problem they had with the Model X early on in its production when they were trying to ramp it up. They ended up having a lot of parts sitting around. They were taking deliveries from vendors because they were contractually required to, but they weren't producing the Model X as fast as they had expected to be at that time. They ended up storing a lot of parts outside, and then a bunch of them got rained on, and some of them were susceptible to rust, and they had these huge write-offs because of it. So they're in an even worse position now just because the number of parts they've ordered for the Model 3 is so much higher, and actually ramping the production has taken so much longer. So they're in dire need of more volume within the factory to store parts.
That seems like a reasonable guess to me.
Yeah. If nothing else, I guess you could just turn it into executive parking. And it'd be covered. So the third thing I want to talk about is this report that came out from a teardown of a Model 3 done by Sandy Munro and his company that's well known in the auto industry for taking new cars, tearing them apart, and then estimating what it costs to build that car. So they have a really good reputation for this. They have a lot of experience at it. And so they took a Model 3 that they bought secondhand. It was I believe, $49,000 version of the car. And they did this complete teardown, assessed the cost of all the parts based on the fact that suppliers who are supplying subcomponents to Tesla provide subcomponents to Ford and Toyota and Honda and everybody else too. So they put together all this information, and they eventually say, well, this car costs $49,000. We think it has a 30% gross margin for Tesla. And I mean, that's great news for Tesla. Wow, if we can just keep selling these $49,000 versions, they'll have really good gross margins. And then Munro also published, here's kind of some rough guesses of what the margins would be for the cheaper versions of the Model 3. We don't really know because obviously right now every Model 3 has the luxury package in it. So you have to have leather seats. Eventually there will be other options, and cheaper seats cost less and have a different profit margin. So they can kind of speculate based on their experience, but they don't know with the level of certainty that they do for this particular configuration of Model 3 that they tore down. So here comes your problem with information. If you like Tesla, you said, wow, 30% margin, and then you just extrapolated 5,000 cars a year, average sale price of $49,000 each, 30% margin, make some other subtractions for, deliveries and delivery costs, and R&D and other things. And suddenly you start coming up with numbers like, they're going to make, $1.5 billion profit next year. We don't know what the average sale price is. We don't know what the mix of models is. We don't know what the true gross margin is. It's incredibly complicated by the fact that they've had to replace robots on the Model 3 assembly line with more humans, which raises your labor cost. They've been running that assembly line 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for a couple of months now, instead of the designed for 2 8-hour shifts 5 days a week. So they've essentially gone from 10 shifts a week to 21 shifts. So they've more than doubled their labor cost in that respect to produce the same amount of cars. There's argument over whether or not they have designed this line for 5,000 cars per week or 10,000, because at times we've gotten conflicting statements from the company of what the ultimate goal is. So there's a small possibility that the whole line is not really designed in a way that it will ever be profitable at 5,000 cars per week. I don't really believe that. I think it's probably designed for 5,000, and all the times they mentioned 10,000 was just kind of pie in the sky stuff. But you have all these unknown additional costs. The Fremont factory on its own has never operated as efficiently as its previous owners operated it in terms of number of cars per factory employee per year. So they have all these additional costs built in. And so it's very hard for Sandy Munro to come in and simply say 30% profit margin, because his point of view is companies like Toyota and companies like Ford. Ford produces a car about every 4 seconds. It's hard to have an apples to apples comparison of a 30% profit margin for Tesla and a 30% profit margin for a mature car company.
Does Sandy Munro factor in assembly cost?
What he's trying to predict is materials and labor.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if he's trying to add in per car depreciation of capital assets used in assembly, things like that. I don't know. He also doesn't factor in all of the costs that Tesla pays for its dealership network.
But he's trying to say things like gluing this panel on costs you like 50 cents a labor, or stamping this panel or whatever. Like,
right.
They're trying to do that. Okay.
Yeah. He says this panel begins as a 2-pound sheet of steel and it's stamped, and then it's glued together by a guy that costs 18 cents for the process of gluing.
Okay.
While he's getting whipped and tased. Again, you have all this uncertainty, and initially the report comes out a couple weeks ago that Sandy Munro says, oh man, Tesla's got a 30% profit margin. It'll be this wildly profitable car. And a lot of people run with that and they say, yeah, great, 30%, the end. And then other people start saying, well, you have higher than expected labor costs just for the Model 3 compared to the original plan Tesla had. You had higher than industry standard labor costs to start with for the company. You have the additional costs that Tesla bears by providing their own dealership networks. You have their incredibly inefficient sales, general, and accounting costs that are far and away blown out of proportion of the rest of the industry. And so you're left with this vacuum where you had what kind of looked like a useful data point to start with at 30% gross margin. And then once you examine it a little bit, you're just totally confused. You have no idea what you're really getting there. And it's going to be much less than that because you have some objective information about how Tesla runs their business and their past costs. But you have no idea how much worse than 30% it'll be. And you also have no idea how well will the demand for $49,000 versions of Model 3s hold up. Is that going to last? Probably not. Maybe for another couple quarters, but what we've seen with the Model S and the Model X over the last couple of years is all the people who wanted the P100D versions, the top of the line versions, the most expensive, those buyers were exhausted. And every quarter, the number of P100Ds sold of Models S and X goes down as a percentage of the total number. And so the mix gets cheaper and cheaper, as you might say, in the auto industry. So you should expect the same thing with the Model 3. So even if they could get 30% gross margin on this $49,000 car, it may turn out eventually that that's only 5% of the Model 3s they sell. And we don't know. We don't know where that will land. We have no idea, what percentage of eventual Model 3 buyers are really holding out for the cheapest $35,000 version. How many are willing to add $5,000 for a luxury upgrade or $5,000 for dual motors so they'll have all-wheel drive? We have no idea. And so there's just this total lack of information. And people have tried to do things like make informal surveys on various Tesla forums and say, hey, if you've got a reservation, what kind of car do you want to buy? And that stuff is all over the place. And you would expect it to change over time. Maybe the mix would get more favorable to Tesla over time because maybe they'll have a lot of good reviews of the car, or maybe the mix will get worse because people will see a lot of forum posts on Reddit and Model 3 Owners Club where people talk about weeks-long waits to get their Model 3s repaired. So again, you've just got this incredible lack of actionable information. And the fact that Sandy Munro comes out and says 30% initially just kind of throws a spanner in the works and doesn't help you at all with trying to figure out what's going on with the company.
I guess you could take the optimistic viewpoint that perhaps they'll be able to reduce the cost to build the cars even more over time. I don't know that there's a lot of indication they've done that with the S and the X, but if they could keep reducing the cost, like maybe the labor cost is secretly really low because they were using just the right amount of robots. I don't think that's very likely, but if you wanted to be really optimistic about Tesla, I feel like that's an argument you could make.
Yeah, and there would certainly be economies of scale. Say that the Model 3 assembly line at Fremont is actually capable of eventually supporting 10,000 Model 3s per week. At that point, they could get much better price per unit from their suppliers.
Yeah, that's true too.
So there are optimistic things that you can conjecture, but we don't even know. It's not just that, Blake and I as people who think Tesla is it's not going great. People who do think it's going great don't really have an idea either. They have no special insight into these things. It's mostly about belief, or it's about acknowledging what you don't know. So the fourth bullet point I want to come to is a set of reports that came out about a week ago that there are thousands of Model 3s sitting in the desert in California, and thousands more in a giant parking lot, I believe, in Burbank. So this came out, and somehow somebody interested enough in Tesla is driving down the highway. He looks over and he sees this giant lot full of thousands and thousands of Model 3s. He posts it on Twitter. Some other people come out with drones, do a flyover, count the number of cars. And then other people start sitting at the entrance to these properties and watching the car carrying trucks coming in and out. And so they're looking for things like what's the total influx or outflow of cars in a day? Are trucks arriving empty and leaving loaded with cars, or arriving loaded with cars and leaving empty? And so initially, what gets into the media is just the photos and the videos of flyovers and things. And so the speculation runs rampant, and initially we have no good information about what's going on here. These cars are not wrapped in plastic like normal cars are when they go for delivery. The ones out in the desert, more desertous area, they're under the hot sun. Is desertous a word?
I think you just made it up just now.
Okay, great. I'll just keep going. What is the correct word there? I can't think of that.
I would have said deserty.
Deserty is not it.
Desertiferous.
Desertatious. Desertopian. So, cars sitting out there in the desert, the temperature is over 100 degrees during the day. There's dust blowing around. And so if you want to eventually claim those cars and go deliver them to customers, they're going to have to be taken somewhere to be washed and wrapped. So you're going to need to move them again, or you're going to have to establish that facility on site. If you're out in the desert, are you going to be able to get permitting to use all that water? Are you going to have to install an expensive water reclamation system? There are tons of questions about this stuff initially. And then as some people started filling in the blanks, they did some research and they found out, hey, these properties are used for basically storing cars that are in the pipeline to be delivered. And so the way this works is you have these companies that deliver your cars for manufacturers, and they own these properties. And so what the company will do is they'll send a car carrying truck to the Fremont factory, they'll fill it up with Model 3s, and then they'll take them out to the desert, and they'll just park them in this huge parking lot in the desert. Then the cars are being batch built. So say they only produce red dual motor cars for 12 hours or something at the factory. Well, all those have to be moved away to make room. And then 12 hours later, maybe I'm just making up 12 hours, they start producing black single motor cars. Well, your dealership in Tallahassee, Florida, it wants one of each of those too. So you can't just dispatch a car carrier across the country carrying one car and do that twice. You go and you queue them up somewhere. And then when all the ones that are ready for some particular voyage to a dealership are ready, they get put back onto a car carrying truck and go to that dealership. And that was a much more plausible explanation because other things were being thrown out, like this is a rework site where, factory gated cars that need repair are being stored. And, people counted up the number of cars. It's like 6,000 of them between these two parking lots. And it's like, would we believe they're really having such a problem with production that they've got 6,000 busted cars? I think they've made something like 35,000 Model 3s at this point. We're to believe that 16% of them are busted off the assembly line and haven't been fixed. So more of them would have been busted to start with and got fixed. That didn't really make sense. But, you still had these problems before people did enough research with the lack of a wrapping station to wrap the car up and things like that. And in this one case, we kind of got enough information filled in that the story made sense. Now, you could still come up with some other questions that you ask. Why don't they batch these cars up at the Fremont factory?
Yeah.
Why are they moving them? And this place in the desert is like, I believe it's like 60 miles east of Fremont or northeast or something. I'm sure some guy who's lived in California forever is going to get on me about like, there's no desert northeast of Fremont, asshole. Why aren't you doing it at the factory? Well, it turns out that when the joint enterprise between Toyota and GM that previously owned the Fremont factory, when they sold the factory to Tesla, Tesla only bought part of the property. And there was something on the order of another 100 acres that used to be part of that property that Tesla did not buy because the land was too expensive. Now, the specific land with the factory on it was much cheaper because probably the compliance cost to tear down a car factory in Fremont is sky high. So that bit of the property is cheaper. The rest of the property over there that Toyota and GM used to queue up the cars on, that can be developed today. So they sold that off at a higher price to, part of it was sold to Lennar, the home developer, and a couple other well-known companies bought other parts of it. So this kind of thing used to be done at Fremont under GM and Toyota. Now there's simply not room there to do it. There's not enough parking lot space. So they're forced to do this, which is unfortunate because it's highly inefficient. They have to pay a company to move the cars out to this other lot. They have to pay the costs of using the lot. And then they have to pay these other people who work for this other company to unload the cars from their trucks and load them back on. And so you've got all these people that are not under Tesla's control. You've got property that's not under their control. And you've got all this added expense of doing this extra unloading and loading of the cars that's unnecessary if you had room at Fremont.
Why do they need to queue up 6,000 cars? That seems really high.
Yeah, so that's an argument I've not heard in this discussion.
Shouldn't you only need to queue up 2 or 3 of each configuration?
No, there's been some evidence for maybe the last 6 weeks or so that Tesla was batch building cars, which makes a lot of sense. It's more efficient. But I think when you say, okay, for the next 12 hours, we're making Model 3 long-range battery, dual motor, luxury package. We're making this one, and the only couple of breakouts we'll do here are 18-inch wheels or 19-inch wheels, and maybe something else small. And so when you get ready and you say, okay, paint shop's got to convert to that color, and everybody be ready, everything gets a dual motor, or however the system queues that up. once you do that changeover, you don't want to change again really quick. You want to run that for a while because you're going to lose some time when you switch again.
Okay.
If nothing else, the paint shop has to do something to switch to the next color.
So you're going to end up producing, like, say you have 10 different types of car, and you produce them in batches of 100, you're going to end up needing to have nearly 1,000 cars queued just to be able to assemble a truck that has one of each type on it.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. That's pretty good math.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense then.
And the thing is, at 5,000 cars per week, which again, I don't think they're running that right now, but at 5,000 cars a week, that's a car coming off the assembly line about every 2 minutes. So, I would wonder how long it takes to have the robots in the paint shop do a color swap so that they're ready to spray a different color. And then you're going, if it's 20 minutes, that's 10 cars that you didn't produce.
Yeah.
So you want to minimize those number of changeovers. It does feel like 6,000 is a lot, because you would think like certain configurations should be more popular, and
yeah,
I don't know, you would think that certain dealerships maybe need 100 cars. They don't need just 8. They need 100. So just take the first 100 that are destined for that dealership, load them on a truck, and go.
Yeah.
So I would think 6,000 is inefficient but plausible. It's at the upper end of what you might estimate is, yeah, that's believable.
And there's still a wait list for people to get these. So you would think there's a car sitting in the desert, and there's also a couple of guys who are waiting for that specific car. And it's weird they can't connect them with a truck.
Yeah, that's the other kind of concerning thing. If you take 6,000 cars and then you say this is an average of, I don't know, let's call it a $50,000 average sale price right now. That's what, $300 million of revenue sitting out there in the desert.
Yeah.
So if they could move it faster, they could realize that revenue quicker and speed up their cash cycle.
Yeah.
Which would be hugely beneficial for them. So that was thankfully kind of a spot where we had all this misinformation at the beginning. And of course, people were saying when it first broke with these pictures of all these cars sitting in the desert, people are saying, look, there's no demand. Nobody wants a Model 3. They're just building them and sticking them in the desert. And hopefully nobody made any investments or trades based on that idea, but I'm sure somebody somewhere did. Somebody went out and shorted the stock a bunch just because of that. But the truth turns out it's not nearly so bad as that, but it's still bad. It's still not good because it's an inefficient way to get your cars batched up for delivery to your dealerships.
Yeah.
So my 5th bullet point here is something that just came out last night. So Blake and I were talking last night. We usually record on Sundays, and we decided to just dick off and talk for 2 hours and not record anything. And it was kind of a good thing because this story was breaking right then. And if we'd recorded a Tesla podcast last night, we would have missed it. A memo was released to the Wall Street Journal from one of Tesla's suppliers. The memo was a request by Tesla that these suppliers basically give them money back for projects that have been ongoing since 2016. And the story breaks and wow, it looks bad. Tesla is literally asking their suppliers for money. Give us money. You're the suppliers, and normally we, Tesla, give you money and you give us stuff. But this time you give us money. And basically the way the memo was phrased was, if you don't give in and give us a little money, we might go bankrupt, and all the money you invested on tooling and machines and everything to supply parts for our cars, it's just all going to be a waste. And it kind of had a note of extortion to it in that sense. And so the memo comes out, Tesla confirms that it's real, and it looks really bad. The market opened down 4% today. Tesla was down 4%, rather, not the whole market, but at the open, it was down 4%. And you kind of had this vacuum in there of maybe 15 hours or so where people just kind of ran with this and took it to all kinds of some logical and reasonable and some crazy conclusions like, man, Tesla is out of cash today. And they're begging their suppliers to basically give them some money or the whole charade is up. And then some people said, "Oh, this is absolutely normal. It's just totally normal when you're in a contractual agreement with a company to, ask them to give you money that's not in the contract." And so you had a real vacuum of information. Again, Tesla stepped in at some point today and they kind of wordsmithed an answer in their usual fashion where they say something like, well, we asked fewer than 10 of our suppliers to, grant us better pricing going forward and to be, let everyone continue to have the opportunity to be a part of this and all this stuff. And so they tried to fluff it up a lot, but there was still essentially the tone of extortion in the original letter. The fact they're asking for money. And when they say something like, it was fewer than 10 of our suppliers, right? Most people are going to say, oh, yeah, that's not much. I bet a car company has like hundreds of suppliers because, a car's got like a couple thousand parts or something. What percentage of your suppliers based on parts volume was it? On total parts cost was it? That's the important thing. If these fewer than 10 suppliers supply 95% of all your parts, then that's really a big deal if you're going to them and saying, hey, we'd like some concessions and some clawbacks here. If they're only providing 3%, big deal. I don't care. Ask them for some money back. You probably won't get it.
I feel like the pessimistic interpretation is that it was their 9 largest suppliers who are over 90% of their parts.
I would certainly agree that it was probably their 9 largest suppliers. I would not conjecture on what percentage of their parts it turns out to be. But yeah, I would bet it's their 9 largest suppliers when they say fewer than 10.
Well, also, in general, you end up with, I can't remember the name of it, like an exponential curve for these things. Like one supplier might be producing just some screws or something like that. And then one supplier is going to be the majority of the interior of a car or something. And
well, right. And for Tesla, it's Panasonic building their batteries.
Yeah. And so your 9 largest suppliers are, unless you have millions of suppliers, they're gonna tend to be a lot, like a huge fraction of your total parts, like well over half.
Mm-hmm. So again, we're left in this situation where we don't really have enough information. We don't know what this really represents. We don't know how significant it is. We don't know if it means Tesla is running out of cash tomorrow, or maybe they just think maybe an executive at Tesla said, we're nearly at 5,000 sustainable Model 3 run rate per week. And let's just get in, let's start a dialogue with our suppliers and say, look, if you give us some support right now while we really need cash, everything will work out and it'll be great. And maybe it was done with the best of intentions, as the nicest guys possible. But we don't know. We don't know how desperate the situation inside the company is right now. So again, we're just left to conjecture and say, how can I make an investable decision based on this? And it's very difficult. You end up having to look at the totality of all these things, and then you have to doubt yourself and say, what if every one of these things is actually beneficial to the company? Can I think of a way in which each of these is beneficial and then plausibly defend that? Even if I think it's highly unlikely, what if that is the case? And I'm betting against that. And so it's very difficult to come up with enough validated information that you trust and you believe to make good investment decisions. And if you could, the rest of the market has already done it. Smarter people have beat you to it.
Yeah. I feel like if you're running out of cash right now, you don't go asking your suppliers for money as I mean, maybe it's not the first thing they did in that circumstance, but it's the first thing that leaked. And it just seems like a really unlikely first or early attempt.
Yeah, I think Tesla is still at the level of burning something like $500,000 an hour. And so you probably could not claw enough back from your suppliers to really keep the place open a significantly greater amount of time.
Why do you think the suppliers leaked the memo?
I think the suppliers are tired of being jacked around on the Model 3. Elon was making claims June a year ago that the car is in production, when it turned out at the time that he was having meetings with his engineers where they said the factory will not be ready before the end of 2017. And yet, publicly, he was saying the car is currently in production. These first 30 that we deliver in, I believe it was June or July of 2017, he says these are production models. They are not test models. They are not validation models. These are production models. And then it comes out later that they were hand-built prototypes. And he's made statements like, you can have no doubt that we will be producing 5,000 Model 3s per week before the end of 2017. Well, here we are halfway through 2018, and they're still not doing it. So all those suppliers who tooled up, who made capital investments of their own, who took on debt, who hired people, who built countless jigs and everything else, did engineering, supplier support, and part design, everything else to support this effort. They've been jacked around for a year now, waiting for this production number that they were told was going to be happening 9 months ago. Mm. And so a lot of them are at their wits' end, I would bet. I obviously have no particular knowledge, but you can imagine if you're a small auto parts supply company that works with some big manufacturers, but maybe you just provide the screws. Maybe that's all you've got. But you make great screws. And now Tesla said we need, 5,000 cars worth of screws every week. So you bought more machines, you hired guys, and you made all this investment. And yet they're taking them and their accounts payable keep ballooning as they're not paying their suppliers for the last 2 quarters. And you're getting strung out further and further and further trying to support this company.
That's a good reason to leak the memo.
So I think that's why the memo was leaked, is that these suppliers are tired of getting jacked around.
Probably the supplier also guessed that they were not the only one receiving the memo.
The other thing is, suppliers in the automotive industry are also supplying to companies besides Tesla. And when they deal with these other companies, a company like GM doesn't say, oh, we're going to start production and we're going to ramp it up. And then it's production hell and it's been a year and we're not at our goal yet and all this stuff. GM just goes out and fucking starts the assembly line, and within about a week, it's running at full tilt. I mean, they know how to do this. It's not a big deal. And so when these suppliers deal with a GM and a Ford and a Toyota, they're told, hey, you need to have this much of a surplus on hand, and then you need to have this much production per day or week or whatever, and get it to our factory. And they know they can rely on those companies to actually start the production and pay them. So the last thing I want to talk about concerning weird information and how are you supposed to invest on this is maybe the oddest part. It's certainly the most subjective. It's this crazy behavior out of Elon and out of Tesla itself. You have this recent stuff with the cave diver in Thailand where he insulted the guy and then eventually apologized. I saw a graph tonight that was the number of tweets per day on average that Elon says, broken down by month-long increments over the last 6 years. So someone went and parsed his Twitter account and they said, for August of this year and for every month of every year for the last 6 years, how many tweets on average did he send during each day of that month? And it's pretty steady pattern, and it kind of grows slightly until the last 2 months it spikes. And it spikes incredibly. 2 months ago, he was sending on average about 3 or 4 tweets per day. And the last 2 months, it's been 14 a day. And They're increasingly outlandish. They're less and less related to Tesla. They're coming in the middle of the night. It's like, what's Elon doing tweeting about this at 4 in the morning? He should be asleep. You know, you don't want your CEO of your $50 billion car company tweeting at 4 in the morning. Though I'm pretty sure that Donald Trump does the same thing, tweets in the middle of the night from time to time. So you don't want him doing it either. You know, what is this erratic behavior all of a sudden? And a lot of people will admit that it seems like the stress is getting to him. Is he crumbling under the pressure of the cash shortage tightening in the company, the accounts payable stretching out, ballooning bigger and bigger? I mean, you know, the whatever problems they're having with raising new money, why the heck they haven't done it yet? There's something standing in the way. Again, we don't know what that is. Is this really him coming to his breaking point? And this is a way he's trying to release some steam? Or is he trolling the shit out of everybody? Is he acting crazy and everything is like sunshine and flowers inside the factory and it's great? And he's just trying to trap everybody who's a bear on Tesla, you know? And you can't really know. People conjecture that he has a certain diagnosed personality type that makes him a narcissist and not very well receiving of criticism and likely to very angrily lash out. And the evidence kind of looks that way, but who knows? If we knew that for sure, maybe we could make some better investable decisions, but we don't know that. And these things just keep piling up. You know, 20 executives left Tesla in the second quarter of this year. And that's unheard of for a company to have 20 executives quit in one quarter. But why is it happening? You know, are these guys, obviously they have inside information. Are they seeing the writing on the wall and getting the hell out? Or are they being pressured to perform in ways they're just not able to? And they just can't cut it, and so they get fired. We don't know. And again, if you're likely to be generous to Tesla, you'll take one view, and if you're not, you'll take the other. And so if you take a more rational view that I need to consider both of those sides and figure out how likely each one is, then you're left just kind of shrugging your shoulders and saying, I don't know what to think.
I feel like a charitable interpretation of his tweets is maybe he hired a PR company and he just says stuff to someone from that company all day and they convert some of it into tweets, and he's not really doing all of these. Because if it just suddenly jumps up, that suggests like a political change instead of a gradual change.
Yeah, that's a good theory.
And hiring someone to manage your Twitter account is like a realistic thing to do.
Yeah, maybe so. That's a good theory to explain essentially the blast off in the number of tweets in the last 2 months.
Also, speaking of predictions about his behavior, we should talk about the prediction for the Thai cave diver tweet and whether he would apologize.
Yes. So that tweet came out at 4 in the morning on Sunday, 4 in the morning where I live in the Central Time Zone in the United States. And sometime around like 9 or 10 in the morning, it couldn't have been that early. You're not even up by that time. It was sometime like a few hours later, Blake and I were talking about it. And Blake said, I bet he'll apologize. And I don't forget, yes, I suggested the time period of 3 days. I said, I think it'll take more than 3 days if he ever apologizes. I do not think he'll apologize within 3 days. And he apologized in like 67 hours. Blake had a narrow 5-hour window still to win that bet.
Yay. That was a really weird thing, though. That was just a weird thing in general. It's not even if you like follow Tesla or care about Tesla. It's like, why is the CEO of a couple of companies caring so much about building a sub to help a rescue operation in Thailand for some kids trapped in a cave? And why isn't his caring taking the form of just sending them tons of money and things that they've asked for? Why is it, I'm going to build my own custom solution and here you go? And then the fact that it was ultimately not used
Yeah.
to some extent indicates that it was not necessarily the most useful thing to provide.
I think what I would have done if I were a CEO and I was looking for PR for my company is I would have gotten in contact with someone there and I would have been like, can I just send you guys like some portable trailers with really good beds and like hot portable shower facilities and make sure that you have really good food and air conditioning and stuff like that. So that when the guys like come off their shift of whatever they were doing for the rescue thing, like they could get a good shower and a good meal and a good bed to sleep in, and then they'd be well rested for the next day. I feel like that would have been much more useful to the rescuers and it would have been great PR.
Yeah.
It would have been like, and of course my company's name would have been on all that stuff. Yeah, it was a baffling incident. What do you do with it? It's not investable information unless you take it cumulatively with the rest of the recently more erratic behavior, and you want to make a bet that he's crumbling under the pressure of the company failing.
Yeah, I wouldn't really expect him to crumble under the pressure of the company failing. I feel like he's got to have been at peak stress levels for years and years now, so I wouldn't expect any particular change.
I don't know. I would disagree with that because the financial numbers have gotten so bad in the last year. I mean, the negative working capital is like $2.2 billion. And so, if they get money from somebody, if they can issue new bonds or more stock, the first $2.2 billion that they get is just going to pay off things they owe immediately. It's not going to help the company or build a factory in China or something like that. And when you're already having whatever the problem is that's preventing them from raising money, then looking at the fact that eventually when you get over that hurdle and you can raise money, you have to raise a whole lot just to get out of the hole you're in. That's got to be incredibly stressful.
Yeah.
And then imagine that you've been working on this company for like 14 years, I think he's been associated with the company.
But they also saw this coming a long way off, and they've had a lot of time to address it.
I think they really believed, or I think Elon at least really believed that ramping up of the Model 3 would go a lot smoother, it would be a lot better received, and that they'd have really high margins, high production, and things would really go great. I think he really believed that. There are some court filings by people who are involved with lawsuits with him now, who formerly worked for him as engineers. And, a year and a half ago, they were telling him it was not going to be that way. And one of the court filings famously has a recounting from the point of view of one of these engineers. And he said that sometime around June of 2017, he was in a meeting with Elon. And he said, basically, there's no way that this factory is going to be producing 5,000 cars a week by the end of this year. And at the end of the meeting, Elon told him, you need to find another place to work.
Okay. That's pretty strong supporting evidence for that.
Yeah. There's some interesting theories out there that Elon's a smart guy. I think he is a smart guy. I don't think he's a genius by any stretch. But Peter Thiel, who worked with him at PayPal, has said that Elon is the man who doesn't know risk. And essentially, several times in Elon's life, he's risked everything, principally when he started SpaceX. You could probably go back and look at sometimes with X.com and getting involved with PayPal and those things. And then when he got brought on to Tesla and eventually took over the company, he's a guy who has legitimately risked everything several times in his life. And it's always worked out great so far. But, I mean, you can only bet everything on black so many times and keep doubling your money.
That's true. But we also don't know how many Elons are out there who lost at different points.
Right. So there's a survivorship bias in this analysis.
Yeah.
Survivor bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of those. And so there were a bunch of people who risked everything and failed, and we don't see them. We see Elon because he's maybe, if, Peter Thiel's theory is true, he's the guy who risked everything over and over and over again and has won every time so far.
Mm-hmm.
There's the famous story of when Elon first became a multi-millionaire in his 20s, he bought a McLaren F1 because that's the car he always wanted. and then he promptly crashed it with no insurance. And it's kind of this illustrative story of how he treats risk. So, like I said, the conference call is Wednesday, August 1st. It's going to be another giant loss, probably on the order of $500 or $600 or $700 million for Q2. The big thing I'm looking at is working capital. It was negative $2.2 billion at the end of Q1. I would expect it to go nearly to negative $3 billion. I would be shocked if it was more than negative or less than negative $3 billion. A bigger absolute number than $3 billion. That's going to be the biggest problem for them going forward, is that their working capital is so bad. And so another thing I want to look at is customer deposits as a percentage of total cash on hand. That's a metric that's been turning more and more against them recently. Their total cash on hand has been going generally downwards for the last several quarters, and the percentage of it that is customer reservations and deposits has been going up, which is really bad if customers hear something like, hey, we need concessions from our suppliers, and then your customers make essentially a run on the Tesla bank asking for all of their reservations and deposits back. So that's something I'm looking at. Wild and crazy behavior out of Elon, sure, that'll be entertaining. We have the Tesla conference call bingo card, as usual, to consult. And the other thing is, how tough will the analysts get? The analysts have started having a pair of balls and asking some good questions. They've started. They're not doing it enough. I recently listened to I read the transcript of the quarterly conference call for the company I work for. And, all the analyst questions are really good. They're all good, objective questions. They're expecting numbers in the answers. There's no softballs like, Elon, how did you really feel when the Falcon 9 launched? We don't care. It's not even the same company. And so, we want to see good questions. The analysts are finally starting to come through on that. So I hope they'll continue. And I hope we don't have guys like Galileo Russell asking softball questions for 30 minutes like we did last time. So,
do you predict any zaniness on the conference call like last time?
I think they would do well to give him a big dose of cough medicine beforehand and calm him down real good, and then put him on the call. I think he would perform well. Maybe he just needs to become a low-level alcoholic so he calms down a little bit, and then he'll be highly effective. I think he's just wired up and stressed out like crazy. I mean, he's like the 50th richest man in the world or something like that, and you imagine that most of his fortune is Tesla. It's his 22 or 24% ownership of Tesla. And then he's looking at the real financial numbers. Him and Deepak Ahua, the CFO, they're looking at the real numbers every day. He's seeing the reality there. And so I can imagine that kind of stress is incredible.
Yeah. He should have just started a cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Hey, he still could.
That's true.
Just start a Tesla coin and have an ICO, and that's how we'll raise money for Tesla.
There you go. What about the industrial espionage / whistleblower guy for Tesla?
Yeah, so that's interesting. His name is Martin Tripp, I believe. And Elon has... Okay, so there are things we know, and there's things that have been accused, and then there's speculation. Okay, and so I'll try to call out which one of those each of these things falls into. We know he worked for Tesla. We know he got fired. The reason he was fired is they said that he had hacked some computers. Now, we all know that the term hacked in a legal sense is really retarded. Things like, logging on to someone's computer with their credentials that you stole somehow is considered hacking a lot of the time, or it's at least reported that way in the media. The suspicion is that he did that, and that's what they're calling hacking. Or maybe he wrote a script that would collect some data and transmit it somewhere, and they call that hacking because he wrote a script. He was also accused by the company of stealing information. Now, the best explanation I've seen of that is that he stole the information and transmitted it to third parties. The best explanation of that I've seen is that he took videos and pictures from inside the factory, and then he sent them to news media.
Mm.
And of course, like, Tesla frames this as he stole gigabytes of information and transmitted it. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess if you're recording a bunch of high def video, then it would eventually become gigabytes.
It only takes a few minutes, really.
Yeah, I guess. I don't really know what the bit rate or whatever the hell is. So I don't engineer that stuff.
It's for nerds.
Now, Tesla also claims that when he was confronted by his management, he confessed. And they fired him. Then there was another really outlandish episode on Elon's part where an email chain was leaked by Martin Tripp or his lawyer or something, where Elon was still like having a flame war with Martin Tripp in emails like 4 days after he was fired from the company. And it's like, your lawyer should be telling you don't contact this guy at all. I mean, you're the CEO. You shouldn't be contacting him anyway. Your only knowledge of this should be like your legal counsel or your security guy should come to you and say, hey, we had this incident and we're handling it. And you should be like, great, just do what you think's best. But instead, like, Elon's up at who knows what time in the middle of the night, flame warring it out on emails with Martin Tripp 4 days after he's fired him. Eventually, Martin Tripp claims he's a whistleblower, of course. And he says, look, there's all these dangerous problems. The factory is unsafe. The cars are unsafe. The process is unsafe. Everything's terrible. Elon's lying. There's securities violations. There's fraud. And so Martin Tripp just throws the whole, everything but the kitchen sink in terms of accusations at Tesla and Elon under the guise that, well, I was a whistleblower and then I was fired for it. Tesla is suing Tripp in civil court. There's been no criminal charges that I'm aware of. I don't really expect any to happen. I think the lawsuit will eventually just quietly go away and everybody will stop talking about it. There were accusations from Elon that he was paid by oil companies and press outlets to steal this information for them and to make up this stuff and do these things. I kind of doubt that. I mean, I'm sure he had a reporter he was involved with, but I'd be surprised if he was getting monetary compensation for this. Maybe that's common and I just don't know it, but it just seems like this really weird episode that probably not a whole lot will come out of. I certainly don't think there's any investable information in it.
Yeah, that sounds accurate. Even if all his accusations about cars being unsafe are true, it doesn't seem like it's going to make enough of a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, Tesla would sink or swim regardless.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the future for the company is still very dim. I think there's still a very, very, very narrow path that they could take to success that does not involve bankruptcy. And, it's going to require them to start executing competently on everything. And it's going to require enough luck that the US economy doesn't go into recession sometime in the next couple of years, that the auto industry doesn't have a downturn, that interest rates don't rise too high. Tesla is already paying nearly $700 million a year in interest expenses. And that's just going to keep going up because a lot of their interest rates are floating. So they're going to have to really get their act together in a hurry and start performing a lot better, but they're also going to have to get really lucky. I think after bankruptcy, Tesla might be a good company depending on who comes aboard, who the new CEO is, who they choose to help run the company, what they choose to do with their current products. But I think the odds of Tesla in its current incarnation avoiding bankruptcy are very low.
Are you making any additional bets on it?
Yeah, I don't know in addition to what. So I guess I'll just go through that history quickly. I had 2019 $50 strike puts, which are essentially a bet on bankruptcy. I sold all of those at a profit. I had bought some of essentially the same put option that expires in 2020 instead. I'm up on those. I haven't sold them yet. At some point, I'll probably sell them and buy the 2021 version when those come out. So I am betting on their bankruptcy, or I can still profit if they don't go bankrupt, but eventually the stock price contracts to actually reflect what the company is worth. And right now, I've made money on every trade, and every position I currently hold is in the black. So
doing pretty good.
Yeah, doing okay for now. But, there's a lot of danger coming for Tesla. They have about $230 million of bonds coming due in a couple of months. They're convertible bonds, and it looks like their stock price will not be high enough to convert, so they will have to pay the $230 million of cash to the bondholders instead of issuing them stock. They have another large amount of convertible bonds coming due next spring. Those convert at a much lower price, so they will maybe convert. They convert at a stock price of $360. So as long as they can keep the stock price up above that during the conversion period, then they don't have to come up with the cash to repay them. Then they have another set of bonds coming due, 2 sets in the third quarter of 2019 that are both rather large, a couple $2 billion combined. And like I said, their working capital is negative $2.2 billion at the end of Q1. And we're now a month through Q3. So they've got to come up with a lot of cash to repay those bonds, or they've got to somehow raise money. It just does not look good. There's incredible dire risk to the company when it comes to Q3 next year with those 2 bond issues coming due within about a month of each other. There'll still be a lot more zany behavior and surprises on the way there, though.
Yeah, I expect
One thing I do really expect is for them to surprise with a reveal of an update to the Model S. Because the Model S is now 6 years old, which in terms of the car industry makes it ancient, since it hasn't had like a real big facelift and a change in design. So they could do something like change the outward appearance a good bit, keep all the drivetrain, everything else the same, keep the interior mostly the same, change it a bit, but make the outside of the car, give it a refresh. And that could really boost sales. It could also boost the price they can sell them for. That's something they've been hurting on, and so they would improve their gross margins on the Model S. I would look for that. That's like the big surprise that I feel like no one talks about. Like something that could happen that could really help the company a bit for the short term.
Yeah, that seems entirely reasonable.
Yeah, and I feel like they don't really need to invest like hundreds of millions of dollars to make that happen. I feel like probably $5 or $10 million they could basically buy new dies and start stamping out different body panels on the same assembly line.
They'd probably figure out how to develop more equivalent horsepower out of it too, so they could sell a higher trim.
Sure.
The P120D.
Yeah. So I kind of expect that to come along and surprise everybody at some point. But ultimately, I don't think the company is going to make it. I don't think they are going to avoid bankruptcy. I think they'll go through bankruptcy. They'll shed their now $25 billion of liabilities. And I think after that, they could be a really nice niche car company.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to ask, Blake?
Do you have any advice to our listeners?
Do not go long or short on Tesla. If you're going to bet for or against Tesla, use options. Also, do not go with options. Don't invest in that at all unless you know what you're doing. Tesla is basically too dangerous of a stock. I mean, and what I'm doing, the particular way I'm doing it just by buying put options, I lock in the maximum that I can potentially lose at the start. That's decided from the beginning. So I know exactly what my potential loss is from day one of my bet against Tesla. And you really don't want to you don't want to spar with this company from any other position. Come onto our Reddit page and tell us why we're stupid. We dare you.
Yeah, I would be really excited to hear why we're stupid.
Yeah.
Also, come to Patreon and become patrons and tell us how stupid we are by donating to us every month on Patreon.
Yeah, that would help too. That would really drive home how dumb we are. It would also drive home how much more wealthy you are than we are. And so it would especially hurt us.
Yeah. You could just donate us a fraction of all the money you're going to make from your Tesla stock going to the moon. That'll show us.